Good morning, folks. I'm Sanjay Nagmangalam, and I've got S. Murli here with me. And the two of us are from the SQL Server group. And today, I'm going to talk about data tier applications in Visual Studio. Turns out they changed the title, kind of a last-minute thing last week. It used to be a very long, simplifying, blah, blah, blah. So now it's data tier applications. The material is exactly the same. It just fits better. OK, so couple of things. We spoke to a number of customers about what challenges there are in when they're developing data tier applications. And these data tier applications are applications that essentially sit in the data tier, things like sprocs, tables, views, triggers, that kind of thing. And we consistently heard essentially a three-pronged set of challenges. During the development phase of the application lifecycle management, customers told us that there wasn't really a uniform project system, if you will. There were multiple ways to go write data tier applications. Can we make this a little more seamless? The other thing that we heard loud and clear was developers, when they're writing data tier applications, they want to specify or say certain things about how the data tier application should be deployed. And there wasn't really a way in Visual Studio for developers to say that declaratively. And the third was, well, our T-SQL editor experience in Visual Studio is somewhat lacking. On the deployment side of things, we found that DBAs and developers continued to essentially work in silos. The developer does a certain, writes a certain app, hands it off to the DBA. The DBA goes, deploys it, probably manages it at some point in time. And there is a bit of an iteration handoff kind of thing, which is essentially error-prone, and it's probably troublesome as well. The other point was, once the app is deployed, there wasn't really a clean containment model. So for example, if you had to uninstall essentially a deployed data tier application, there wasn't really telling what else might break. Classic problem. Well, once the app was deployed, it was essentially difficult, if not tricky, to manage the thing that you've deployed. Turns out that the number of SQL Server instances were, well, rising. There was essentially the sprawl factor, if you will. And as I spoke to earlier, from the management point of view, there wasn't really a good way for IT admins and DBAs and even developers to figure out what happens if I change this, what's the impact analysis like, what does my resource look like, and so on and so forth. So we listened to customers, and we essentially started investing about a year ago now, about 8 months ago, in these three-pronged areas of challenges that we heard. On the development side of things, what we did was we introduced the notion of a data tier application project in Visual Studio. You guys are probably familiar with database projects that we released as a GDR. So this is a project system that lives side by side with that, and I'll talk to it a lot more now. So this is a brand new project. We also added a brand new T-SQL editor experience in Visual Studio. And we did a bunch of work on integrated, the editor, IntelliSense, debugging capabilities, and things like that. We also added the notion of a policy editor, if you will, which lets developers declare intent right inside Visual Studio. As just like any other good VS citizen, we added the beginnings of static code analysis, and we have a full-fledged build service. I'll show you examples of these as I go forth. On the deployment side, essentially what we did was we made the act of deploying a data tier application a lot simpler than what it is today. Essentially, we added the notion of being able to deploy right from within VS and also from SQL Server Management Studio. We essentially defined a new unit of deployment in Visual Studio 2010, and that unit of deployment captures the data tier application and the developer intent for deployment as a single thing. Once we did that, management became a lot simpler. In fact, in SQL Server 2008 R2, we introduced the notion of the control point. It's called the utility as well. So the idea is you can take SQL Server instances and enroll them with a control point. And the moment you do that, you have all kinds of tools right inside SQL Server Management Studio that let you look at instance and application usage patterns, usage data, and metrics, and things like that. This helps you do trending. This helps you do look at your resource utilization, improve costs as you go over time. So I'm going to kind of give you a sneak peek on all of these investments and take it from there. All right. So concepts. What is this data tier application thingy anyways? So the notion is brand new project type in Visual Studio. It leverages the database project system as you know it today. It essentially lives side by side with it. First class T-SQL editor in Visual Studio. And as I said, the notion of developers being able to declare deployment intent. When you build this project, out pops what we call a DACPack, a .DACPack file. And that's essentially the packaging format, if you will, for the data tier application that's your project plus your intent. The moment you take this DACPack, you can hand it off to a DBA who can go use SSMS to deploy it. What is a DACPack? Well, essentially, the idea is it improves collaboration between developers and DBAs. So DBAs have one less thing to worry about, if you will. Developers now can think about declaring intent in a declarative way rather than in a procedural way. I mean, I don't have to call up the DBA and say, hey, that's what I really wanted you to deploy it, kind of thing. The intent travels with the DACPack. So specifically, no alter statements, no SQL scripts to run. The developer produces a DACPack, which has the intent, hands it off to the DBA, and the DBA goes deploys it. Also upgrades it, and I'll show you those in a minute. The key point here is the DACPack essentially has the shape of the desired data tier application. And what happens is when you go deploy the data tier application, it allows tools to look at the current shape of the application and the deployed shape of the application. And tools can now jump in and do what we call drift detection. It can essentially examine the two shapes and make the deployed shape so, make it so, kind of thing. That picture there essentially shows, I mean, think of this as your schema, which is your logical and physical concepts, and a bunch of deployment policies, and they travel together. That essentially is a DACPack. And the data tier application project produces a DACPack. V1, DAC V1 is targeted squarely at department labs. And I'll tell you what we mean by department labs in a minute. Okay, so high-level concept count. So what we are seeing is, I mean, if you look at this picture, we try to kind of come up with this picture to explain the kind of databases we are targeting. So what you're seeing is, as you go from the bottom to top, there are a number of apps are on the rise, and as you go from left to right, you have a few large enterprise scale apps, which typically have dedicated IT or DBA guys to go manage them. That said, we're also noticing that the number of these small apps are increasing. So that's what we call department labs. What happens is the number of small apps are increasing faster than DBAs can manage them. And that's essentially the target of DAC V1. So we are focusing solely on department labs. Okay, let's compare with what we know. I mean, today we have the database project system, and there's the data tier application project system, and both live side by side, as I was telling you in VS 2010. The database project system does a great job of looking at or handling mission critical, business critical, large scale data applications, while the data tier application project is targeted at department labs. We both start on VS and go create your project and so on and so forth. And when you build a database project app, out pops a .db schema, like today. You essentially go do a bunch of script generation from that DB schema, and you take those SQL scripts and deploy it to SQL Server 2005, 8, R2, and so on and so forth. On the right-hand side, well, you start with Visual Studio, like you would expect, create a new database, data tier application project, build it, and out pops a .DAC. And you take this DAC and you deploy it to SQL Server R2, SQL Server 2008 R2. So that essentially is a very, very high-level comparison of how these two project systems work. Both are available in Visual Studio 2010. OK. More differences, slightly more detailed differences. Application target, I already told you. Well, data tier applications target these departmental apps, these lots of fast-growing small apps. That's the sweet spot. As far as database supports is concerned, database projects support a wider variety of databases, while DAC v1 supports SQL 2008 R2, and we plan to support SQL 2008. There is no notion really of capturing deployment intent at development time in database projects, while we've introduced that notion in data tier application projects. And finally, there is this notion of upgrade. I mean, well, you've deployed the app, you kind of go make changes, then you redeploy it, and then what happens? So database projects have essentially a certain way of doing it. Project build generates the necessary alter scripts, and they have this concept of a data motion. They kind of detect whether or not data needs to be moved over and generate scripts accordingly. There's a bunch of documentation on MSDN. That said, on the right-hand side, for data tier applications, there are no SQL scripts. When you take that DAC and you deploy it, the deployment pipeline essentially takes care of doing what we said earlier, the drift detection thing, and it migrates your schema and data automatically. Works in most cases, and yes, there are gotchas, but that said, the target is solely departmental apps. So for that workload and that schema complexity, it works fine. There are also differences in the number of SQL Server types that we support. Database projects support all of them, as you know, while DAC v1 supports them partially. So for example, there are file streams or XSD column references and so on and so forth, which are not supported yet. So the last para is where our investments really shine, because what we've done is we've taken our IntelliSense experience and debugging experience and the T-SQL editor experience and made them work for both. So I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute. Key point, both project systems exist side by side in Visual Studio 2010. OK. Let's look at a pictorial view of how the develop, deploy, manage cycle, if you will, works with a data tier application project. So I mean, let's say on the far left, top left, I have my dev database. A developer will more than likely use Visual Studio. In the deploy pipeline, if you will, I've put a picture of SQL Server Management Studio because I'm going to go use that tool more often than not to deploy. And finally, after the app is deployed, I'll use SQL Server Management Studio again to deploy the app, upgrade the app, and so on and so forth. And on the bottom right, I have my production database. So the idea is the developer fires up Visual Studio, reverse engineers a DAC right into Visual Studio. Now, there are a number of options the developer has. I just picked this one for illustration purposes. The developer could start from scratch and so on and so forth. Developer iterates on this, authors policies right inside Visual Studio, and then creates objects, maybe deploys it against the dev database until the dev is happy, if you will. And that cycle can carry on for a few iterations. When the developer is happy, developer builds the project and produces a DAC pack. And once you produce a DAC pack, you can go take this and hand it off to the DBA. And the DBA can fire up SSMS, essentially start a new wizard that we've added in SSMS in SQL Server R2 to go and deploy it on the production box. The DBA can opt to first time install versus upgrade and so on and so forth. Once it's on the production box, you can fire up SQL Server Management Studio again and connect to the production box directly to do things like manage, maybe register a new data tier application, uninstall a data tier application, and so on and so forth, even upgrade. What we've done is in SQL Server 2008 R2, as I was telling you earlier, we've introduced this notion of the SQL Server utility. And there is the notion of taking an instance and enrolling it as a managed instance with a control point. Now, if this production database happened to have been enrolled as a managed instance using the same SQL Server Management Studio, I can actually connect to the control point and look at the dashboard and see statistics, app level and instance level statistics of my deployed data tier application. So that essentially is the value prop. So key point is you can go use SSMS to go deploy this data tier application. You do not have to register it with a control point to go use this facility, but if you do, then you get a bunch of dashboard things that you can go look at, metrics and so on and so forth. Okay, let me show you some bits in action. So what I'll do is I'll switch over to my other box here. Okay. All right, so that's Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2. It's available for download, so I mean, I highly encourage you to go download it, play with it, and things like that. So everything that I'm doing here, you can actually try for yourselves and play with the bits. Okay, so the first thing you'd notice is, I mean, just like I used to create a database project, in the same node under SQL Server, I have this data tier application project. So it starts its life as a brand new project system, and I click OK. If you notice, the project structure, if you will, is similar to database projects. So there are no surprises here. The idea is you've used database projects before. You have acquired a bunch of knowledge, and you can go leverage that knowledge in this new project system. If you will, it's strikingly similar with a bunch of differences, and I'll point those out as we go forward. We've created item templates for pretty much the objects we support and the common ones. So what I'll do is I'll go create a table. I'm not going to make this very interesting, so the interesting comes later. So I'll just leave this at the default values here. I'll also add a view. It's fine, boring view one. So here's one of the things we added. So I can actually do. So notice IntelliSense, one thing that is pervasive all across in Visual Studio 2010 is IntelliSense. We call this offline IntelliSense. Essentially, if you notice, I'm not connected anywhere. So the Visual Studio project system and the editor knows to go look in the project system and suggest values as I'm typing. So pretty key difference, and this thing works in database projects too. So far, so good. While I'm here, I'll also add a sprock. I'll go for the defaults here. I'll just put a 1, and maybe I'll say the same thing here. Okay, so far so good. What we've done is essentially created a table, a view, and a sprock, and I showed you what offline IntelliSense looks like. What we've done is, as part of the project system integration, we've added the notion of being able to do static code analysis. So we've plugged in into the static code analysis pipeline, and I am able to do static code analysis from here. So we have a bunch of rules that are defined for this project system. The rules are simplistic, gotcha. That said, we have a pipeline engine now. We can go build on and add, over time, add new static code analysis rules that are applicable to T-SQL. So here, I'll just go do that. Let me try running this. Okay. As you would expect, errors appear in the error list, or warnings appear in the error list. And like any other good VS citizen, double-clicking on the error takes you to the offending thing. Now, okay, fine, it took me to the offending thing. I don't really know what to do. Well, all you got to do is hover that mouse over there, and it tells me, again, IntelliSense at play. It tells me what the potential values can be. So I'll quickly go fix this. Again, I mean, the reason for the static code analysis error is, I mean, I did a select star, probably a frowned upon practice, if you will. it's basically telling me, hey, if the underlying table or view changes, your Sprock might change. So it's probably a bad idea. And as I'm typing, IntelliSense again. I'll go to the other one and do the same thing, and column 2. And I'll go run static code analysis again, and the errors go away. So again, starting off our investments into plugging into the static code analysis pipeline, if you will. OK, so fine. I don't have any static code analysis errors, at least the ones that they reported. So now what I want to show you is the thing that I talked about earlier, is the notion of the developer being able to declare deployment intent right here in Visual Studio. So the easy way to do that is that. Now, that's one of the differences between database projects and data tier application projects. So I can go double-click on that SQL Server selection policy. And what we've done is we've included a number of facets, if you will, that you can go and use. For this particular one, what I want to try and do is I'll select the version major facet. And what I want to do is I want to tell declaratively that I want this application, my data tier application, deployed only on SQL servers whose major version is 9. And I just click OK here, save it off, and go build. When I build, out pops a DAC pack. And that's my unit of deployment. So this is something I can go hand off to my DBA. Well, this is also something that I can deploy to my dev database, right, from within Visual Studio. So we added this notion of what we call internally quick deploy. I actually expect this deployment to fail. That's because I don't have a connection string yet. So I'll go add a connection string. And if you notice, we've made changes to the project properties page, which light up in data tier application projects. And I'll just go edit here. So now I have a connection string. Build again, and deploy again. Of course, I expect it to deploy again, fail again, because the instance of SQL Server I have on this box is SQL Server 2008 R2, which is really 10.5, if you will. So it's going to fail again. So I'll go fix it. And fixing it couldn't be easier. I just go there, and I say greater than or equal to. And now I'll go build and deploy. And hopefully it works this time. It's doing a bunch of other things. So key point is, I go created a data tier application, very, very simplistic one for demo purposes. But that said, I could actually say right in Visual Studio that the deployment intent. And we have a number of facets. Over time, we are planning to add to those list of facets and go from there. OK, so fine. My app is deployed. Life is good. Notice I'm still not connected anymore. Still not connected at this point in time. So what I typically want to go do is, well, let's test some of the stuff that I've deployed. So I'll go and add a script. And what I'll do is connect to a database, the instance that I deployed. That's a brand new toolbar that we added. So it lets me connect to instances, write test scripts and run them and so on and so forth. So I'll go connect to my local instance because that's where I deployed the app. And what I'll do is, so if you notice, as I'm typing, the editor is now suggesting possible candidates. This is online IntelliSense. So the editor is now smart enough to figure out that, hey, I'm connected. There's a deployed data tier application out there. So let me go suggest IntelliSense based on what the thing that I'm connected to. And then I can go say, let's say I'll exec procedure 1. So again, online IntelliSense at work. How do I know that I'm connected? Well, the friendly toolbar there tells me what's going on. I'm about to exec the script. So let me turn on a few things here. Maybe I'll turn on client-side statistics. So the scenario here is, all right, I wrote a data tier application. I iterated over it, set a bunch of policies, deployed it. And now I want to see, well, does the thing work or not? So I'll go and execute MySQL. I get the usual columns, messages, whatever, but I also get client statistics. In fact, I can do one other thing, and let me see if I can. There. Show plan, right inside VS. And one less reason for you to switch to SSMS, if you will. So that's brand new. So again, back to my scenario. All right, so I deployed my data tier application, set a bunch of policies, I'm happy. I ran the script. I noticed that in show plan, maybe the table scans that I expected weren't really what I expected. I mean, I thought this query is too expensive. Maybe this proc is doing something weird. So, well, what do I do next? So let's say I'll save this and I'll reopen it. Connect again. And this time, I'll set breakpoints. So what I'll do is I'll go set a breakpoint where I want and basically start debugging. I'll give it a minute to finish. So the intent is I ran my script, found a problem area, and now I want to go debug. And I can do all that right from within Visual Studio. OK. All right, my breakpoint gets hit, and I can do my usual F10, F11 things. I'll keep going inside. I come to the proc, and I can actually go right inside this proc. So integrated debugging. And the things that you would expect of a classic, good, well-behaved Visual Studio citizen are there. I mean, there are autos, there are locals, there's a watch window, call stack, the works. You can essentially debug your sproc right inside your database, data applications from Visual Studio. Tasks that were traditionally, either in some other tool or maybe SSMS, you can go and iterate over your data tier application right from within Visual Studio. All right, I'll keep going. Okay. So fine, I've debugged my sproc. I'm happy. Maybe I fixed the problem and so on and so forth. Turns out that during my analysis, I had the need to go change my schema. So I'm right here. I'll go and maybe make this null, remove that. And now that I've made this change, I want to actually find out compare it to the deployed application. So database projects have schema compare, and what we did was we made the schema compare workflow work with data tier application projects also. So here, and then again, there are differences. There are differences between database projects and data tier application projects. So what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to compare the schema in my database one, my project, to the database, the deployed database. And it'll go do the comparisons. And it appears in the UI you expect, essentially the UI that you're used to with database projects. There are gotchas. From a DAC perspective, we do not want you to create alter statements to go change the database, because the deployment pipeline takes care of that. So in this particular instance, we won't let you update the database because the target is a database. Now, this would have worked quite fine if the target was another project, say. So because you can go change that. So the key point here is because the unit of deployment is a DAC pack, which captures the shape of the application and the intent, the deployment pipeline goes and makes it so. So we don't want you to go create alter statements here. So again, a quick example of schema compare. It shows you the differences in this case. All right. Sure. I'll just get out of this one. OK. Again, like very well-behaved citizens, as you would expect, there is very deep DFS integration, source code, source control integration. So you can check in this project into source control into Team Foundation and things like that, multiple checkouts, all of that. It all just works. I mean, there's no surprises there. If you noticed, when I started this project, I actually started from scratch. But you have a number of options. I mean, say you have a script from somebody, from a coworker or maybe a legacy database. You can seed this project, a brand new project, with a script. You can also seed it with a data tier application, as in a DAC pack, and I'll show you that in a minute. OK, so for this, for the next part of my demo, I'm actually going to wear a slightly different hat, if you will. First, let me close this guy off. OK. So I'm actually going to go into SSMS. And the scenario that I'm trying to show you folks is, let's say you got a script from somebody, a .SQL script, which has the schema, the script to create a table, and so on and so forth, and also populated with data. So in this particular example, I actually have the script for the pubs database. So I'll open this up. So this creates a database and also populates it with a bunch of data. So I'll go run it. So now that I have pubs, there it is. Now that I have pubs, what I can do is I can register it as a DAC. So if you will, this is a classic scenario, where we bring legacy apps forward, if you will. In fact, that pubs came from 2008. OK, so I'll go register it as a DAC. And all this is brand new. So this is an SSMS now. So this starts a wizard that essentially takes your database, starts up a wizard, looks at what objects are supported in V1 and so on and so forth, and adds metadata about this to MSDB. So essentially, it associates your database with the data tier application. I'll continue with the wizard. It asks me for a version number and so on and so forth. I'll just go with the defaults. OK. It gives me essentially a status of what's supported and what's not. And I'll finish this. So I'm taking an old database, which I had, and I'm registering it as a data tier application. Once I do that, it'll essentially show up here. So I mean that's my old deployed database there, and pub shows up as well. OK, so now that I have a data tier application, which I got from old and registered it in SSMS, I'll go and extract a data tier application. What this does is essentially you can point it to a database, and it produces a .DAC pack. And guess what I can do with that DAC pack? Well, one of the many things I can do is I can seed a new Visual Studio project with it. That's what I'm about to do. So I'll produce the DAC pack. I'll put it on my desktop. OK. All right. So I have a DAC pack here. Actually, while I'm here, let me do a couple more things. Let me just do a oh, by the way, IntelliSense and SSMS as well, in case you didn't notice. All right, so I have data. I have a bunch of data here. I have columns. So just wanted to show you this quickly before I switch over to Visual Studio. Bring up Visual Studio again, and I'll create a new data tier application project. Maybe I'll call it pubs, because I'm about to import the DAC pack into it. OK. Just make this a little bigger because of my resolution. And I put it on my desktop, so it should be over there. There it is. And keep going. All right, I finish. So this is an example of how I exported a DAC pack from SSMS and seeded my data tier application project in VS with it. Schema objects are where you'd expect them, right under tables and so on and so forth. Well, why did I do this? The reason was to kind of show you that I can actually go and change the data now, change the schema, if you will. So what I'm going to do is I'll just hide this for a little bit. and I'll add a new column called mname. Make a little bit of change and make that nullable. While I'm here, I may as well add a view as well. So let me add a new view. Okay. I'll call this author names. And I'll say authors is fine. I'll ignore that static code analysis error for now. And again, while I'm here, I'll also go and specify a deployment policy. So what I want to say, tell the system is, hey, version major, go set version major, and I'll say is greater than or equal to 10. Since I have 10.5, this should work. Okay. So let's recap. I had a DAC pack that I produced from SSMS, imported it into VS, added a brand new column and a new view, set one deployment policy, and I'm going to go and build it. Now, I'm not going to deploy it from Visual Studio this time, because what I want to do is I'll just remember this, the location of the DAC pack there, and go back to SSMS. And since I have this pubs already deployed as a data tier application, I can actually upgrade it right from here and point it to that DAC pack that I produced from VS. So what it's doing now is it essentially is looking at the DAC pack, looking at the policies that came that I authored in Visual Studio, and it says, hey, okay, the value falls within the expected range. Good. Then it goes and detects change. This is the thing I was telling you about, the drift detection part. Since it knows the new shape of the application and the deployed shape of the application, it can now compare the two. And essentially it says, hey, okay, you didn't do anything wrong or bad. You essentially added a column and added a new view. Life is good. And then it'll go and do it. While it's doing this, so essentially it's looking at the two versions. It incremented the version numbers automatically because VS did it, and it came over here and it registered it with MSDB, upgraded the registration information, and while it was at it, it also moved data over. The thing I should point out, gotcha, if you will, DAC v1, we support side-by-side upgrades. So essentially the old version of pubs is still there, and we actually created a brand new database and copied the data over. Okay, so back to pubs. Let me just close that window there. So now I have an mname column, and the old data that was there is still there. No surprises here. The other thing that is available for you is also that view over there, the one that I just added. So that's there as well. So I mean, essentially proof that the deployment did indeed happen. Okay. Back to my presentation. So essentially, what I showed you was two broad scenarios. One that talked about the developer experience enhancements in Visual Studio for database data tier application projects, and essentially a comparison with existing database projects. And then the tooling that we've done in SQL Server Management Studio to support the notion of a DAC. Key takeaways are first-class developer experience combined with the ability for developers to specify deployment intent that both travel as a .DAC pack, and then you can use this DAC pack either during iterative development in Visual Studio or in SSMS to upgrade applications and install applications or uninstall applications. Where are we going next? So in order to say where we are going next, I have to kind of remind ourselves as to where we started from. So back in Visual Studio 2005, we introduced the notion of database projects, if you will. We added the notion of application lifecycle management for database projects. We introduced the notion of offline change management, so that wasn't really there before. We released the GDR in 2008, and what that did, well, it added support for SQL Server 2008, and it had the notion of build versus deploy. So essentially separated the two concepts. So we didn't really need a temp DB during development time anymore. You could develop offline and deploy later. In Visual Studio 2010, we introduced the notion of data tier application projects, and these live side by side with database projects. The target applications, however, are different. Yeah, they operate side by side. We added support for SQL Server 2008 R2. We added a whole bunch of editor support, editor features, IntelliSense, both offline and online, build pipeline, and so on and so forth, refactoring, application lifecycle management support. And database projects added support for third-party databases. So they made those APIs public. They weren't public in the GDR. Going forward, the intent is to take both of these project systems and take the best of each and combine them into a single, essentially, way of working with databases, data tier applications. So we are clearly committed to adding SQL Azure support. I mean, you heard in Ray Ozzi's keynote. So I mean, that's very, very pervasive. In fact, we are already thinking on ways to go do that. We're investing heavily in visual designers. So I mean, there are a bunch of table and database designers in Visual Studio and in SSMS today, and we are thinking hard on how we can take those designers and make them work against the DAC, if you will. So we are looking at that. We want DAC v2 to grow up. So essentially, we clearly wanted to support mission-critical and large-scale enterprise applications, grow up from departmental, if you will, and then complete the support for SQL Server objects, the things that we do not support, the things that make sense to support in a DAC. So we'll go at that. We have a number of project system enhancements planned. I mean, there are a few refactoring ideas that we are thinking of, and we are prototyping today. So we'll go add those. And finally, a bunch of application lifecycle management features. So the key point is, as we go forward, we're going to take database projects and data tier application projects and take the best of both. And that's where we are headed. That was it. I would highly encourage you to download the bits. I mean, SQL Server 2008 R2 is available. Just got released last week, the November CTP. And Visual Studio 2010 Beta 2 is available. And you guys should go download or obtain CDs from the PDC. I think they're available here. And try this out for yourself. I welcome questions now, but that said, if there are questions that you think of later, send me mail. I am sanagama@microsoft.com, and he's smurli@microsoft.com. And we're both available. We'll help answer your questions. And that was pretty much it. Your feedback is important. Please tell us how we did. Please give us, point us in the right direction, and we'll course correct as necessary. So with that, I'll open this up to questions, thoughts, comments. Yes. Absolutely. Yeah, I'll leave it on that slide. Yes, sir. Question. Okay, so I'll rephrase your question. Tell me if I'm wrong. You want to add seed data as part of your project. Is that the question? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So that is possible, and you can do that using post-deployment scripts today in data tier application projects. So that scenario definitely works. Yeah, question?
Essentially, there's a feature when you deploy a data tier application, you actually keep the old copy.
Yeah.
So do you have an option to turn that off?
Okay, so the question was, when we deployed the database project, the data tier application project, we kept an old copy. Is there an option to turn that off? Today, there is no option. And in the future, we are looking at it. Yeah, question? So the question was, is this integrated into the build server, TFS build? Yes, it is.
Once you deploy a new version, is there any way to roll back to your previous stack?
Okay, so the question was, once you deploy a new version, is there any way to roll back to a previous DAC? So, yeah, you can take that.
So one thing I should say is that as long as you have the older DAC, you can simply walk up to the same thing, and while we call it an upgrade, it really means go to next version or go to new version. So you can essentially use the same workflow to go back to your older DAC if you wanted it to. Does that? Right now, there isn't a way to do that, use that particular thing. That's something that we will definitely explore. It sort of comes back to the other question about how much of this do you want to keep around for. So that's something that we're working on. We don't have support for.
So when you keep the old comment, can you make like some difference rather than keep the entire topic? Because I may have like 100 gig data. I don't want to copy over.
Yeah.
However, I do want the feature rollback.
Sure. So the question was, is there a way to essentially keep a differential of the older database rather than keeping a full copy of that database, right? The short answer is right now there isn't a mechanism, and we are certainly looking at ways of achieving that particular thing. I think as Sanjay pointed out earlier, we're sort of targeting it at the lower end of the applications, the departmental applications, where the size isn't as much of an issue. That said, as we want to grow up the application stack, we definitely recognize that this is a huge issue, and we are looking at ways of optimizing that. So not in this release, but we are certainly looking at ways of enabling that.
Can we upgrade to the R2, or does it need to be a new install?
You mean when you install R2?
2008,
Yeah.
like have 2008 already, will it upgrade to R2, or is it going to be new install?
So when you install R2, is this a question about R2?
I have 2008 that I just installed, and I wanted to see going to R2. Would I have to move all the databases again, or does it upgrade the server?
I don't know the answer to this one, but let me follow up, and I'll follow up with you after this.
What about DAX and RD databases? Do you want to do like small updates? Do you have to do the whole copy, or can you do a differential alter?
So the question was again, when I've only made a small change to my overall DAC, is there a way to essentially make just that particular change rather than make an entire copy? Right now, in this particular version, no. It's essentially a full copy. We definitely have that as one of the top priorities we are addressing sort of going forward. And again, I'll sort of come back to the statement about sort of initially targeting smaller databases for which this isn't as much of an issue, but clearly this is it's very, very high on our list of things to go off and do.
When you said you made that copy of the database, is it rename the old one to be something else and then make the new one the
Yes.
real name?
So the question was, do we rename the old database as part of that copy and make the new database the new one effectively? Yes, that's right. So it's the old database is named old database with some timestamp plus GoId or something on those lines to essentially make sure that it's available still.
If that application is hot and people are hitting the old database while you're upgrading it, what happens?
So
It's supposed to be something you do when it's down.
So the question is, what happens when people are sort of still hitting that old application while you're upgrading the stuff? There are no great answers for this. The short answer is that we try to minimize the amount of time that the old application is down by essentially keeping the older copy up and at least read-only for as much of the time as possible. But that said, there is a window of effective downtime where you have to transition over to the new ones. As a best practice, I would generally always say that the online upgrade mechanism is not something that we are yet there at. I mean, it's probably going to take us at least one more release or two more before we get to the true online capability of that stuff. So there's always going to be a finite amount of downtime. We're working very hard to minimize that downtime, but we also recognize that it's not usually the case that people want to just online upgrade the entire thing. There's sort of processes that they have to follow before they actually go off and deploy a new application. But that said, again, the overall question of minimizing downtime is a very important one. We're looking at that. Let me take this one.
Does the DAC concept is supported in the MSI model as well?
So the question was, let me paraphrase. I mean, you're saying, is it supported in the MSI model, and can you give me a little bit more of?
If I want to, can I include DAC in MSI as part of the deployment?
He hasn't installed it.
Not yet. we're looking at doing that stuff. I think at this point in time, we're looking more at integrating with things like MS Deploy with their mechanisms rather than MSIs per se, but I would love to sort of get a little bit more of what you're thinking on in the MSI front, and I'll follow up with you after.
Kind of along the same lines of the question that was just asked, is there a way to execute a DAC code programmatically?
Sure. So the question was, is there a programmatic way to access the functionality of the DAC pack? And the answer is absolutely yes. We have an object model built around the DAC pack, and that's essentially a publicly available DLL. You can wrap them. I mean, our blessed mechanism is essentially to wrap them with a set of PowerShell scripts and go run those sets of PowerShell scripts. But yes, absolutely, we want the ability to have programmatic and UI parity on all of these things.
So, I mean, to your MSI question, one proposal could be to include a .DAC pack in your MSI package and use the object model to go deploy it. That is definitely a possibility.
Yeah, I was wondering if there was intrinsic support or not.
Not yet.
There was a question over here.
Let's say you have a new DAC pack and you have made a bunch of changes. And in one of the changes, you added a new constraint.
Mm-hmm.
And right after you deploy, all the changes go through. And only the last change is going to violate some of the data integrity in the tables.
Mm-hmm.
So how is that going to handle?
So the question was, I've added a new constraint to my DAC. There's a set of existing data, and there's a set of existing changes. Most of the stuff actually works fine. It's the last change, a small subset of the changes actually violate that constraint, and what happens in that particular scenario. Right now, it's an all or none experience. I mean, the whole thing works or it doesn't work, and we'd like to preserve the atomicity of that stuff. We're trying to move to a model where we say it's sort of the application, if you will, and part of an application being bad isn't something that we'd like to start off with. That said, I think we recognize that there are cases at least where you're staging the stuff and you want the ability to sort of apply corrective action on the stuff in the future. We're looking at ways of doing that. We don't have any of that support right now.
So does it tell you what change sets were successfully run, what change sets?
Right now, it sort of gives you it gives you an error message, at least at the statement that was offending, right? But that's not exactly the same as telling me what succeeded and what failed.
Is this supported in MSD? Meaning I have SQL, MSD for the client. Will it still work?
So the question.
I run the DAC pack in the program.
So the question is like, is the DAC stuff supported against MSD? And so my assumption is that as long as it's SQL Express or one of the supported versions of SQL Express over here, 2008 or higher, it should work. 2008 R2 or higher. We are working on the 2008 support, so that's something that's.
More questions? Yes?
Is there any way that we can create, like in Visual Studio 2000, we usually create a solution folder. Is there any way we can create a similar kind of folders into the database side so that we can categorize the number of objects virtually rather than creating
Well, you could use various tricks in Visual Studio. I mean, you could add linked files and so on and so forth, right, between two projects if that's what you're asking. But there isn't a real clean solution. The one ability that we've added is if you go to project properties in a data tier application project, you can actually switch between what you want, a data tier application project versus a database project. Oops. Yeah, you could do that, but that said, it works in most cases, but there are certain differences between like the one that I showed you, the SQL policy one, doesn't really apply in database projects. So chances are you can go switch it from project properties and delete the things you don't want. So that would be a good starting point. Yeah, question?
How extensive is that debugging that you showed us in Visual Studio? You showed the parameters coming into the procedure. Can you debug the parameters and the variables inside the process itself?
Yes. Yes, you can add watch windows, you can add locals.
You just put breakpoints like this.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
What support is there if you need to refactor data in order to migrate from one version to the next? I mean, how expensive can that be, or is that a lot of custom scripting?
So, yeah.
No, go ahead.
Let me understand your question. So when you say refactor data,
Like change the type of the data or something? change a column type or something like that?
So column type changes are generally not a problem at all, as long as any existing data that you have is consistent with the newer version of that particular type. So there are two parts to the question. One is like, what set of refactoring UI support do I have to actually make those set of changes? The other one is like, regardless of how I got to the new version, I've got some changes, and how well do those changes play? In terms of the actual refactoring changes, I mean, right now we sort of plug into the overall database project refactoring subsystem, but there's not a whole lot that we support in that particular pipeline. We look to extend that stuff in terms of splitting tables or partitioning tables and stuff like that. We don't have that support right now. But the other side of the question, however, regardless of how I got to the point, as long as I've generated a new version of that particular DAC pack, and as long as the transitions between those pieces are consistent, things should work fine. I changed int to Archer, things should work fine, or something on all of those kinds of things should just be fine.
Are there any improvements on the spatial indexes?
The question was about improvements of spatial indexes, but was the question specifically about the data tier applications or just in SQL Server? There are a bunch, and there is a session talking about SQL Server spatial support, but I'm probably not familiar enough with that to talk about it.
So was there a plan to integrate this with like linked SQL and the entity framework?
So the question is there a plan to integrate this stuff with linked to SQL entity framework and other stuff? And short answer is yes, we are definitely working on some of that stuff. It doesn't exist and it won't happen as part of this release, but that's definitely one of the things that we're looking at, so that I can essentially publish a model and stuff happens automatically under the covers. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even as it stands today, you can have a single solution with two projects, right? I mean, that said, we are looking at very hard at, a very more seamless integration, certainly. Okay, good. Thank you very much. If you think of more questions, please send us mail.